The lobby of Harrington Dynamics headquarters was the kind of space designed to make people feel small. When the battered Ford F-150 pulled up to the front entrance that Tuesday morning, a young woman near the reception desk was the first to notice. Megan Carter let out a short laugh loud enough to carry and turned to the colleague standing beside her. "Did a delivery guy take a wrong turn into the shareholder meeting?" The laughter spread across the lobby like a small fire. The man stepped inside, worn work boots, faded jacket, old leather briefcase, and said nothing. Nobody knew that the Gulfstream landing on the private tarmac behind the building had his name on the door. The F-150 had nearly 200,000 miles on it. The blue paint had faded unevenly along the hood, and one of the rear panels carried a dent that had never been fixed, a shallow crease from a fence post on a property in rural Tennessee that no longer existed. Lucas Bennett drove it the same way he drove everything, without ceremony, without explanation. He had left his house before sunrise, taken the back roads out of Clarksville, and merged onto the interstate just as the sky turned from black to a flat, pale gray. He was 42 years old, and on paper, he owned everything inside the glass tower currently rising in his windshield. Harrington Dynamics, logistics infrastructure, aviation contracts, freight management systems running across 17 states. The company had grown quietly over the course of 15 years, the way certain things grow when no one is watching them too closely. Steadily, without announcement. Compound interest on a decision made before most of his current employees had finished college. Lucas had built it from a regional freight brokerage his father had started in a strip mall outside Nashville, absorbed 3 smaller competitors during a downturn, and pivoted the entire operation toward air logistics before anyone in the mid-tier market had taken the idea seriously. He was not a man who talked about this. He was a man who made decisions and then went home. Home for the past several years had meant a house on 12 acres with a vegetable garden that mostly failed, and a workshop where he restored furniture by hand when he had nothing else to occupy his evenings. His wife Rachel had died 6 years ago from an illness that arrived quickly and left no room for negotiation. After that, the house had grown quieter, and Lucas had grown quieter along with it. He kept the truck because his father had driven it. He kept his routine because routine was the only structure that held when everything else had already fallen apart. The decision to come to headquarters in person had not been made lightly. For 3 months, his inbox had been accumulating something that looked in aggregate like a pattern. A resignation email from a logistics coordinator in Memphis who cited a hostile work environment, but offered no specifics. A complaint filed through the HR portal by a freight analyst who had been with the company for 4 years before leaving without another job lined up. A performance review flagged by one of his regional directors as unusually punitive for an employee with strong metrics. None of these things read individually would have warranted much attention. Together, they told a different kind of story. Lucas had read each one twice, and then he had called Olivia. Olivia Reed had been his executive assistant for 8 years. She was meticulous, direct, and had a particular talent for saying exactly what she meant, without softening it for comfort. She had told him plainly that the complaints were clustering around a single management layer in the Central Operations Division. She had named the location. She had named the division. She had not named the manager because she believed he should see that part for himself. Lucas had agreed. He told her to arrange the Gulfstream for that Tuesday, but to arrive behind the building through the private entrance 2 hours after he did. He wanted time on the ground, first, unannounced, unrecognized, unremarkable. He parked the truck in a visitor space at the far end of the lot, the kind of space no one with a reserved badge would touch. He took the old leather briefcase from the passenger seat, the same one he had carried since his mid-30s, its brass clasps worn to a dull finish. He was wearing dark work pants, a collared shirt with no tie, and a jacket that had seen better seasons. He looked like a man who worked outdoors, or perhaps a man who had once worked outdoors and never fully updated his wardrobe to reflect anything different. He looked, in other words, like someone who had no business being in a place like this. He walked through the front entrance and into the lobby. The lobby of Harrington Dynamics headquarters had been redesigned 3 years earlier by a firm in Chicago that specialized in corporate interiors. It featured a 40-foot ceiling, exposed steel beams, a reception desk built from reclaimed wood and brushed aluminum, and a floor-to-ceiling glass wall that faced the eastern parking lot. It was objectively an impressive space. Lucas had approved the budget for it without ever seeing the finished result in person. He had reviewed the photos, said it looked fine, and returned to a logistics contract that required more immediate attention. Standing inside it now for the first time, he noticed that it was also very loud. Voices carried, footsteps echoed, and the cluster of people near the reception area seemed to exist in a state of continuous low-level performance, aware of being seen. The woman who had laughed was still standing near the reception desk. He had heard her from across the lobby. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dressed in a fitted blazer and tailored slacks, the kind of outfit that communicated seniority without confirming it. She was speaking to 2 other employees while looking in his direction, and her expression had not returned to neutral. It carried something residual, not quite contempt, but the cousin of it, the satisfaction of a joke that had landed. Lucas did not look at her directly. He walked to the reception desk and gave the name he had arranged in advance, a first name only listed in the visitor log as a consultant attending the morning briefing. The receptionist, a young man who was visibly trying to manage 3 things at once, handed him a badge without ceremony and pointed toward the elevator bank. Lucas clipped the badge to his jacket and turned toward the building's interior. He was 3 steps past the desk when the woman's voice reached him again. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to the 2 colleagues beside her, but she was not making any effort to lower her volume. "I don't know why they let walk-ins through the front door on a meeting day," she said. "Someone's going to have to check if he's in the right building." One of her colleagues offered a short laugh. The other looked at the floor. Lucas continued walking. He spent the next 90 minutes moving through the building's common areas, the second-floor break room, the open workspace adjacent to the Central Operations Division, the corridor outside the main conference suite. He was not invisible. People noticed him, the way people notice anything slightly out of place. A brief glance, a recalibration, then a return to whatever they had been doing. A few assumed he was a contractor. One woman in the break room asked if he was there to look at the HVAC system because the second floor had been running warm. He said he'd take a look, which wasn't entirely untrue. He was in a functional sense here to assess what was broken. What he saw in those 90 minutes was not dramatic. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to watch precisely because of its quietness. A group of employees in the operations bullpen worked in a particular kind of silence, not the productive silence of people concentrating, but the careful silence of people monitoring themselves. Eye contact was limited. Conversations at desks dropped in volume when a certain figure moved through the room. The figure was the woman from the lobby. Lucas watched her cross the floor twice, and each time she passed, something in the room contracted slightly, and then expanded again when she was gone, the way a muscle releases after a sustained clench. Her name, he would later confirm, was Megan Carter. She was a regional operations manager 2 years into the role, and based on what he observed in that short window, she ran her section of the floor the way certain people run things when they have mistaken authority for identity. She spoke to some employees with easy familiarity, and to others in a register that was technically professional, but carried a consistent undertone of impatience, as though their presence in her sightline was a minor inconvenience she had learned to tolerate. Lucas had seen this particular management style before in other companies, in other industries. He knew exactly what it cost over time, not in a single incident, but in the slow accumulation of days where talented people decided their effort wasn't worth the friction. He was standing near the window at the far end of the operations corridor when Megan appeared again, this time moving with purpose. She stopped when she saw him. Her expression shifted recognition of the anomaly, recalculation of what to do about it. She walked toward him with the specific stride of someone who had decided to handle something personally. "Can I help you?" she said. The tone was not helpful. It was the tone of a question that meant something else. Lucas told her he was there for the morning briefing, that he was on the visitor log, and that his badge had been issued at the front desk. He said it without any particular emphasis. As a person states facts, they do not expect to have to defend. Megan looked at his badge, then at his jacket, then back at his face. "The morning briefing is a senior leadership session," she said. "It's not open to contractors or outside vendors." She said the words contractors and outside vendors with a specific kind of precision, the way someone uses clinical language to deliver an insult without technical liability. Lucas said he understood and that he would wait in the corridor until the session began. He said this calmly, which seemed to irritate her more than any argument would have. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary before she turned and walked away. A colleague of hers, a man in his mid-40s, who had been watching from a few feet away, made brief eye contact with Lucas and then looked quickly at his phone. He did not say anything. Nobody did. This, Lucas thought, was the part that cost the most, not the people who acted badly, but the people who watched and calculated that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of silence. He remained in the corridor. He checked his watch, a plain steel model, no brand visible from a distance, and noted that Olivia's arrival window was still approximately 40 minutes out. He had time. He used it to listen. The thing about standing still in a building where no one knows who you are is that people stop performing for you very quickly. Within 10 minutes, he had become part of the furniture, and the furniture, as it turned out, heard quite a lot. He heard 2 employees in the hallway discuss a colleague who had left the previous month, someone named Davis, apparently a strong analyst, who had put in his notice after a performance review that nobody in the group felt reflected his actual work. He heard one of them say quietly that Davis wasn't the first and probably wouldn't be the last. He heard the other one say nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. He thought about the resignation email sitting in his inbox. He thought about the HR complaint filed by someone who had been with the company for 4 years. He thought about the performance review flagged by his regional director as unusually punitive. He was no longer looking at 3 isolated data points. He was standing inside the pattern they described, and it was larger than he had anticipated, and it had been running long enough that the people inside it had stopped expecting it to change. There was a choice in front of him, and he was aware of it with the same clarity he brought to any decision of consequence. He could walk back down to the lobby, find Megan Carter, and end the ambiguity in about 30 seconds. He could tell her his name and his title and watch the entire dynamic of the morning rearrange itself in real time. He had done versions of this before, not often, but enough to know exactly how it would unfold. The apologies, the sudden attentiveness, the recalibration of everyone in the room. It would resolve the personal friction immediately and tell him almost nothing useful about anything that actually mattered. The other option was to stay as he was, unnamed, unremarkable, the man from the visitor log, and let the morning continue on its own terms. This would cost him something. He already knew that Megan Carter was not finished with him, and that the next encounter would likely be less contained than the last. But it would also show him the building as it actually operated, not as it performed when the owner was known to be present. And that, at this particular moment, was worth considerably more than his comfort. He straightened the briefcase in his hand, leaned back against the wall, and stayed exactly where he was. The morning continued around him. Down the hall, a printer jammed, and someone swore under their breath. A meeting ended, and a dozen people filed out carrying coffee cups and expressions that ranged from focused to glazed. The building moved at the particular rhythm of a Tuesday, purposeful but not urgent, everyone tracking their own small orbit. Lucas watched it all, and the longer he watched, the more certain he became that what he had driven 4 hours to find was already in plain sight. In the silence between conversations, in the careful way people moved, when Megan Carter was in the room, in the easy cruelty of a laugh, in a lobby that everyone had heard and nobody had questioned. He had built this company for 15 years. He had made it out of his father's belief that a business was only as honest as the people running it from the inside. That belief had shaped every decision he'd made, who he hired, how he structured incentives, what he refused to tolerate from the top down. And somewhere in the gap between what he had built and what he was standing in right now, something had gone wrong in a way that spreadsheets and quarterly reports had not been designed to catch. His phone showed a message from Olivia 20 minutes out. On schedule. Lucas put the phone back in his pocket and looked down the corridor toward the lobby where the shareholder meeting would begin in less than an hour, where Megan Carter would shortly return, and where the morning was about to become considerably more complicated for everyone involved, including he knew himself. He had made his choice. He was going to see this through. The shareholder meeting was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock in the main conference suite on the 4th floor. By 9:45, the lobby had shifted register entirely. The loose Tuesday morning energy replaced by something tighter, more deliberate. People moved with purpose. Now badges, visible conversations clipped. A catering crew had set up a long table near the elevator bank with coffee urns and a spread of pastries that no one was touching. Security had added a second checkpoint at the stairwell entrance, a portable desk staffed by a guard in a company-issued jacket who was checking names against a printed list. Lucas watched all of this from a chair near the east wall of the lobby, the leather briefcase resting against his leg. He had taken the seat 20 minutes ago, and in that time, 3 different people had glanced at him with the particular expression of someone trying to place a face and failing. None of them had approached him. None of them had said anything. He was to all visible evidence a man sitting in a chair, which was apparently unremarkable enough to be ignored, so long as no one with authority decided otherwise. Megan Carter decided otherwise at 9:52. She came down from the operations floor via the main staircase rather than the elevator, which meant she crossed the lobby in full view of everyone already gathered near the conference suite entrance. She had someone with her, a younger associate male, who was typing something on a tablet and keeping pace slightly behind her left shoulder. She saw Lucas from across the room, and her stride did not slow, but something in her expression sharpened. She walked directly toward him with the focused economy of someone who had already decided how this conversation would go. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question. Lucas told her he was, and that he was waiting for the session to begin. Megan's associate glanced up from his tablet, and then immediately looked back down at it, the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to be invisible during his manager's corrections. Megan crossed her arms and looked at Lucas with the expression of someone performing patience for an audience she knew was watching. "I explained this earlier," she said. "This meeting is for senior leadership and shareholders. It's a closed session. You're not on the confirmed attendee list." Lucas said his name was in the visitor log and that his attendance had been coordinated through the executive office. The executive office coordinates logistics for board members and C-suite, Megan said. Not for outside consultants. She said the last 2 words with a particular flatness, as though she were reading from a policy document. Around them, the lobby had grown subtly quieter, not silent, but attenuated, the way ambient noise pulls back when something more interesting is happening nearby. A few employees near the coffee table had turned fractionally in their direction. A woman by the elevator was no longer looking at her phone. Lucas did not raise his voice. He said simply that he'd appreciate it if she confirmed his entry with the executive office before making a determination. Megan looked at him for a moment that stretched past professional courtesy. Then she said, "I don't need to confirm anything. I'm telling you that this floor and this meeting are restricted, and if you're not on my list, you're not getting through that door." She gestured toward the conference suite entrance with a precise motion that managed to be both dismissive and final. "I can have someone show you back to the main reception area." She turned to the security guard at the stairwell desk without waiting for a response from Lucas. A brief exchange followed too low for anyone beyond the immediate area to hear, and then the guard stood and began moving toward where Lucas was seated. Not aggressively, not with any particular urgency, but with the unmistakable body language of a man who had been given a task and intended to complete it. The associate with the tablet had retreated 2 steps and was now standing at a careful distance, typing nothing. Lucas stood before the guard reached him. He picked up the briefcase and moved toward the edge of the lobby, not toward the exit, but toward the far end of the east wall, near a row of chairs that faced the building's internal courtyard windows. The guard followed for 3 steps, then stopped when it became clear Lucas wasn't heading for the door. He looked back at Megan. She gave a small nod that meant close enough and returned her attention to the conference suite. The lobby resumed its pre-meeting rhythm slightly louder now that the episode had resolved the way rooms do when tension has been discharged through someone else's humiliation. Lucas set his briefcase on the floor and sat in the new chair and looked out at the courtyard. A few ornamental trees were planted in a square of exposed soil in the center of the space. Someone had installed a bench that no one appeared to use. The whole arrangement looked like an idea of restfulness rather than actual restfulness, designed to suggest that the company valued such things without requiring anyone to act on it. He thought about the employee named Davis, the analyst, whose name he had overheard in the hallway upstairs. He thought about the resignation email from the logistics coordinator in Memphis. He thought about the HR complaint from the freight analyst, who had left without another position lined up, which meant she had been unhappy enough to absorb the financial risk of unemployment rather than stay 1 day longer. These were not abstract data points anymore. They were the logical downstream result of what he had just watched happen in real time, a management style so embedded that it operated openly in a public lobby in front of a dozen witnesses on a Tuesday morning before a shareholder meeting without anyone appearing to consider that it might be worth questioning. This was the part that required the most honest accounting. Megan Carter had not appeared in this company fully formed. She had been hired, promoted, given authority, and retained through every quarterly review cycle that had passed since she took the regional manager role 2 years ago. The complaints that had reached Lucas's inbox were not the beginning of this pattern. They were the point at which the pattern had become severe enough that people were willing to put their names on a document and submit it through an official channel, which in his experience represented a significant threshold of discomfort. The complaints were the visible fraction. The rest, the quiet exits, the lowered ambitions, the careful silences he had observed on the operations floor were the larger mass below the surface. He had been too far removed. He knew this without any particular drama, the way a person knows something they have been avoiding knowing. He had built the company's structure for efficiency and trusted the layers between him and the daily operation to maintain a culture that reflected his own values. That trust had been at minimum under-inspected, and the cost of it was sitting in the lobby of his own headquarters, having just been told by one of his own employees that he was not allowed through a door in a building he owned. His phone buzzed, a message from Olivia 7 minutes out. He put the phone away and looked toward the conference suite entrance. Megan had moved to the door and was greeting arriving executives with a warmth and ease that bore no relationship to the register she had used with him. She touched one man's arm and laughed at something he said. She guided another woman toward the coffee table and gestured expansively at the pastry, spread with the fluid hospitality of someone entirely at home in this space. She was good at this part, the visible, social performance of leadership. She moved through it naturally without apparent effort, which made the contrast with everything else he had observed more stark rather than less. The conference suite doors opened at 10 past the hour, and the assembled executives began moving through in clusters. The security guard returned to his desk. The lobby thinned. Megan stood at the entrance, managing the flow, checking badges and names against her list with the practiced authority of someone who had made this role her own. Lucas remained in the chair near the courtyard windows and watched the room empty around him until he was one of only a few people remaining in the lobby: a receptionist, a woman waiting for a visitor badge, and one of the catering crew quietly consolidating the coffee urns. Then Megan turned and saw him still sitting there. She walked over with a directness that left no room for misinterpretation. She had two people with her. Now, not the associate with the tablet, but a heavy-set man in a security uniform and a woman in her mid-40s who had the careful bearing of someone in HR or legal. The formation of three people walking toward a seated individual in an otherwise empty lobby carried its own particular meaning, and everyone remaining in the room understood it. Megan stopped in front of him. "I've been generous with my time this morning," she said. Her voice had not risen, but its texture had changed. It was harder now, less administrative, something closer to personal. "You're not on the attendee list. You're not a registered shareholder. You're not a vendor with an active contract because I checked. Whoever you spoke to about attending today made an error, and I'm going to need you to exit the building." She let that sit for a moment, then added, "Some spaces aren't for everyone. That's not a judgment. It's just how organizations function." The woman in her mid-40s, who Lucas now identified as someone from the building's HR or compliance division, based on the lanyard she was wearing, looked at a point somewhere between his left shoulder and the exit sign behind him. The security guard had positioned himself about 4 feet to Megan's right, not blocking, but present in the unmistakable way that presence is used as a form of argument. Lucas looked at Megan directly. He did not move immediately. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they want to remember clearly, not with hostility, but with attention. The lobby was quiet enough that the coffee urn clicking through its final cycle was audible from across the room. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the briefcase. He said evenly that he would step outside and wait for his party to arrive through the south entrance. They were less than 10 minutes out. He said this the way he said most things, without seeking permission as a statement of fact, rather than a request. Megan said that would be fine. The phrasing was measured, but the satisfaction behind it was not entirely concealed. He walked toward the front entrance. Behind him, he heard her say something to the security guard, in a lower register, a brief instruction, a loose end being managed. The glass doors opened automatically as he approached, and the morning air outside was cooler than the lobby, carrying the particular flatness of a day that hadn't yet decided what kind of weather it intended to be. He moved to the side of the entrance plaza, away from the main doors, and stood with his back to the building's exterior wall. From this position, he had a clear sight line to the south side walkway that connected the private entrance to the front of the building. Olivia would come from that direction. He had told her the timing. She would not be late. He looked out at the parking lot. His truck was still in the visitor space at the far end, small and faded against a row of late-model sedans and a pair of leased SUVs that probably cost more each month than his father's original freight brokerage had cleared in a quarter. He wasn't thinking about the truck. He was thinking about the woman in the HR lanyard who had stood 3 feet from an act of routine humiliation and looked at the exit sign. He was thinking about the associate with the tablet who had retreated to a careful distance and typed nothing. He was thinking about all the employees on the operations floor who had learned to contract when Megan Carter walked through the room, and who had been doing so long enough that the contraction had become reflex invisible to themselves. He checked his watch. 2 minutes. The Gulfstream would have landed by now. The private runway was 8 minutes from the building at normal ground speed, and Olivia did not waste time between landing and moving. He had used the south entrance once before, years ago, during a legal matter that required discretion. Olivia knew the access code. She had known it for 8 years, the same way she knew most things he needed her to know, without being asked twice, without requiring explanation. Through the glass doors behind him, Megan had returned to speaking with the receptionist, her back to the exterior. She had the satisfied posture of someone who had resolved something efficiently. One of her colleagues said something to her, and she laughed, her shoulders moving with it, easy and unguarded. She had already filed this morning under minor administrative friction, already moved on to whatever came next. He looked at his watch again. The sound reached him before the figures did the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of footsteps crossing the south side walkway. More than one person. The sound of people who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to move faster than was necessary. Lucas turned toward the corner of the building. Olivia Reed came around the south edge of the entrance plaza, first moving at the pace of someone who had arrived on schedule and had no interest in performing urgency. She was followed by two men in dark suits, carrying document cases, and a woman who had the focused, economical energy of someone's legal counsel. Olivia was on her phone, but she was not looking at it. She was looking at Lucas. She covered the distance between them without adjusting her stride and stopped in front of him with the ease of someone arriving exactly where they meant to arrive. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. The board members are coming through the south entrance now. Everything's prepared inside." Then to the group behind her, without ceremony, "This is Lucas Bennett, chairman of the board." The sentence landed in the air of the entrance plaza and did not immediately dissolve. It sat there. The security guard near the door looked at Megan. Behind the glass, Megan had turned at the sound of voices outside and was now looking directly at the group on the plaza. Olivia looked at no one in particular, already scrolling through something on her phone, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had other things on her agenda. Megan came through the front doors. She had not been summoned. She had simply moved toward the situation the way people do when they are not yet certain what the situation is. She stood on the plaza and looked at Olivia, then at the two men with document cases, then at Lucas. Her expression did not collapse all at once. It moved through several positions in rapid, involuntary succession. The first, a kind of skeptical recalibration. The second, something closer to recognition. The third, a stillness that was not composure, but the thing that comes before composure fails entirely. Her colleague, still visible through the glass doors, had gone very quiet. The guard had taken a half-step back. The receptionist had looked up from his desk and was watching the plaza with the complete attention of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that would be discussed for a long time. Lucas looked at Megan once briefly without expression. Then he turned toward the entrance and walked inside. The lobby reconfigured itself around Lucas Bennett's presence, the way rooms do when the fundamental assumption holding them together has just been removed. The receptionist had stood up from his desk without appearing to decide to do so. The catering crew member who had been consolidating the coffee urns had gone still. Two employees who had been crossing the lobby toward the elevator bank had slowed to a stop near the center of the floor, holding their badges and their coffee cups and making no effort to pretend they were doing anything other than watching. Olivia moved through the front doors one step behind Lucas and spoke briefly to the receptionist in the low, efficient tone she used when things needed to happen quickly and without drama. The two men with document cases positioned themselves near the elevator bank. The woman who had been identified as legal counsel stood near the reception desk with a phone to her ear, speaking to someone on the other end in short, precise sentences. The whole operation had the quality of something that had been planned in advance and was now simply executing, each person knowing their role, no motion wasted. Megan Carter came through the front doors 30 seconds after Lucas. She had not been stopped, but she had not been invited either. She stood just inside the entrance and looked at the lobby she had managed so confidently 40 minutes ago, and something in her bearing had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. She was still dressed the same. Her blazer was still straight. But she was standing slightly apart from the room in the way that people stand when they have understood. All at once that the ground they were standing on was not the ground they thought it was. Lucas did not look at her when she entered. He was speaking with Olivia, who was walking him through the morning's adjusted schedule. With the same brisk competence, she brought to everything her voice low enough that the conversation was private, while her movements made clear that the day was now proceeding on a different set of terms. One of the board members who had arrived through the south entrance, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had been with the company's board for 9 years, crossed the lobby, and extended his hand to Lucas with the easy familiarity of someone who had known a person long enough to dispense with formality. They exchanged a few words. Gerald glanced once in Megan's direction briefly, and then returned his attention to Lucas, Megan's associate. The younger man who had carried the tablet that morning appeared at the edge of the lobby from the stairwell entrance. He looked at the assembled group near the elevator bank at Megan, standing near the front door, and at the board members moving through the space, and arrived at an understanding of the situation with the speed of someone who had been paying close enough attention all morning to connect the points without difficulty. He quietly withdrew back through the stairwell door. Lucas rode the elevator to the 4th floor, with Gerald, Marsh, Olivia, and the 2 men with document cases. The conference suite that Megan had been managing access to all morning was already occupied. A dozen senior leaders seated around the central table laptops opened the structured pre-meeting restlessness of people waiting for something to begin. When Lucas walked in, the room did what the lobby had done. It recalibrated. Several people who had been in the building all morning and had never laid eyes on the company's owner had the specific experience of information arriving too fast to process gracefully. A regional director near the window looked at Lucas, then at Olivia, then back at Lucas, and chose to say nothing until the situation became clearer. Lucas took a seat at the head of the table. Olivia placed a folder in front of him and took a seat to his right. Gerald Marsh sat across from her. The legal counsel entered behind them and positioned herself against the wall to the left of the door with a yellow legal pad and the efficient stillness of someone who was there to document, not to participate. Lucas looked around the table without any particular expression and said he appreciated everyone making time for this meeting. He said this the way he said most things, without inflection, that would tell you how to feel about it, which had the effect of making everyone in the room very attentive. He said that the morning had been instructive, that he had spent several hours moving through the building unannounced, and had observed things he wanted to address directly, rather than through a written memo or a management directive that could be filed and forgotten. He said that what he had observed was not primarily a performance problem or an operational problem. It was a culture problem, and culture problems were harder to fix because they didn't show up in quarterly reports until they had already cost you people you couldn't afford to lose. The room was completely quiet. The regional director near the window had closed his laptop. Lucas said he had reviewed a series of complaints and resignation patterns over the past 3 months, and that he now had sufficient context to understand what had been generating them. He said that a comprehensive review of internal complaints, performance evaluations, and exit interview records from the past 18 months would begin within the week, overseen by an external HR firm that Olivia had already engaged. He said that any manager whose conduct was found to have contributed to a hostile or discriminatory work environment would be subject to consequences appropriate to the severity and duration of that conduct, and that this was not a statement made for appearances, but a description of what was actually going to happen. He said one more thing before he moved on to the meeting's formal agenda, that the standard by which people were treated in this company was not contingent on how they dressed, what they drove, or what floor they worked on. He said this without raising his voice, and without looking at anyone in particular, and because of that, everyone in the room felt it was addressed specifically to them, which was more or less the intended effect. The shareholder meeting ran for 2.5 hours. It covered the things such meetings cover: financial performance, regional expansion plans, a new air freight contract that Olivia had been negotiating for 4 months, and which represented a meaningful step into a market segment the company had been circling for 2 years. Lucas moved through the agenda with the focused efficiency of someone who had read every document in the briefing packet on the 4-hour drive, and had arrived with the questions already formed. The room responded accordingly. The early atmosphere of careful uncertainty settled into the rhythm of a working session, and by the time they reached the final agenda item, the meeting had the texture of something productive. Megan Carter was not in the room. She had not been summoned, and no one had asked about her absence. The external HR review took 11 days. The firm Olivia had engaged was based in Atlanta, and specialized in workplace culture assessments for mid-size corporations, with a particular focus on identifying systemic patterns that internal reviews tended to miss, for the obvious reason that internal reviewers were embedded in the same systems they were assessing. They conducted 47 interviews across the Central Operations Division and adjacent departments. They reviewed 2 years of performance evaluations, flagging cases where ratings diverged significantly from objective productivity metrics. They cross-referenced exit interview records with team-level attrition patterns and found 3 distinct clusters where turnover rates were running at more than double the company's baseline, all of them concentrated in the same management layer. The report was thorough and, in the clinical language of HR documentation, damning. It confirmed that the resignation patterns and complaint filings Lucas had identified were not isolated incidents, but sequential outputs of an environment where employees who lacked social proximity to certain managers were systematically disadvantaged in performance reviews, project assignments, and internal promotion decisions. The report named behaviors. The report named dates. The report named the employees who had raised concerns and the specific ways those concerns had been either dismissed or used against the people who raised them. Megan Carter was the central figure in the report, though not the only one. 2 other managers in adjacent roles had participated in or enabled the same patterns to varying degrees. One of them, upon learning the review was underway, had submitted his resignation before its findings were finalized. The other cooperated with the process and was placed on a supervised performance improvement plan with clearly defined terms. Megan did not resign. She retained outside counsel and submitted a written response disputing several of the report's characterizations. Lucas read her response in full. It was well constructed and argued certain points with genuine precision. It did not change the material findings. After consulting with the board and his own legal counsel, Lucas made the determination that her employment would be terminated effective immediately, with a severance arrangement negotiated between the 2 legal teams over the following 2 weeks. The process was conducted without public announcement and without the kind of dramatic confrontation that the morning in the lobby might have seemed to be building toward. It was handled as Lucas preferred most things to be handled, through the appropriate channels, with documentation without theater. The woman in the HR lanyard, whose name turned out to be Sandra Cole, a compliance officer who had worked for the company for 6 years, requested a meeting with Lucas in the 2nd week of the review. She had been one of the 47 people interviewed, and she had, by all accounts, been thorough and candid in her testimony. She came to the meeting with a folder of notes and an expression that sat somewhere between professional composure and the residual discomfort of someone who had been carrying something for longer than was comfortable. She told Lucas directly that she had known for several months before the review that the complaint patterns in the Central Operations Division were more systemic than they appeared on paper. She said she had flagged it twice through internal channels and had been told both times that the matter was being monitored. She said she wanted him to know that she understood in retrospect that monitoring was not sufficient and that she had not done enough to escalate beyond the channels available to her. Lucas listened to this without interruption. When she finished, he told her that he appreciated her saying it, and that the same accountability he was applying to the managers involved in the review applied to the systems that had allowed the situation to continue unchecked, including the internal escalation process that had absorbed her concerns without acting on them. He told her that her candor in the review had been noted, and that he had no intention of penalizing employees who had tried to work within a process that had failed them. He meant it. Sandra Cole nodded, gathered her folder, and left the meeting, looking if not entirely absolved, then at least lighter than she had arrived. The structural changes took longer than the personnel decisions. Lucas worked with his regional directors and a small internal task force over the following 3 months to redesign the performance evaluation framework, removing the subjective weighting criteria that had allowed personal bias to be encoded into formal reviews without detection. He restructured the internal complaint process so that escalation above a certain threshold required direct notification to the executive office rather than remaining within the local management chain. He brought in a leadership development program for mid-level managers that was by design less focused on technical skills and more focused on the kind of interpersonal accountability that tended to get assumed rather than taught. He did not announce these changes with ceremony or send company-wide emails describing his personal commitment to culture. He implemented them and had Olivia track their outcomes with the same metrics framework the company used to track operational performance. If they worked, the numbers would show it. If they didn't, he would revise them. By the end of the third month, the attrition rate in the Central Operations Division had dropped to within a normal range. 2 employees who had left in the previous year made inquiries about returning. One of them came back. The operations floor no longer carried the contracted silence Lucas had observed on his first visit. This was not something he measured directly because he had no instrument for it, but he was told about it by his regional director in a quarterly call in passing. The way people mention things when they have forgotten to be careful about what they reveal, the floor feels different now. Lucas noted it and moved on. He drove back to Clarksville the evening after the shareholder meeting ended, taking the same interstate he had driven that morning in the dark. The sky was doing something significant over the western horizon, the kind of late afternoon color that accumulates before it fades, orange going to pink, going to a blue that was almost gray. The truck moved through the light the way it always moved through things, without particular grace, without complaint, covering distance. The heater still worked only on the passenger side. He had known this for years and still had not fixed it, and at this point, he understood that he never would. Not because it wasn't worth fixing, but because some things are most honest. Left exactly as they are. His father had bought the truck in the late 90s for the freight brokerage. He had driven it to every meeting, every warehouse visit, every early morning pickup for 11 years before his hands made it difficult, and he handed the keys to Lucas without ceremony, the way his father had handled most transfers, as though the thing being passed was simply ready to go to the next person who needed it. Lucas had driven it ever since. He had been offered better vehicles many times, in many configurations, and had declined each time for reasons that he had never articulated to anyone else and did not feel the need to. The truck was not a statement. It was not humility performed for an audience, or a calculated signal about values, or a story he was telling about himself. It was his father's truck, and his father had been a man who built something real with ordinary materials, and the truck was one of the ordinary materials. That was all. The fact that other people read it as something to laugh at was information about them, not about the truck. He thought about something his father had said once during a difficult stretch in the brokerage's early years, when a larger competitor had tried to undercut their rates, and several of their main clients had moved their contracts. His father had not been dramatic about it. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at a spreadsheet on a yellow legal pad, and he had said without looking up, "The real measure of what you've built isn't what it looks like from the outside. It's whether it holds when someone applies pressure. If it holds, you're fine. If it doesn't, now you know what to fix." Lucas had been in his 20s then, and had understood the principle without fully understanding its weight. He understood it better now. He had applied pressure to his own company deliberately by walking into it as a stranger, and what he had found was that it didn't entirely hold. The infrastructure held, the contracts held, the financials held, but the interior, the daily texture of how people treated each other, the accumulated small decisions about who deserved respect and who could be dismissed without cost. That part had drifted away from what he had intended to build quietly over time, in the space between his attention and the company's daily operations. He had fixed the part he could fix. He was under no illusion that fixing it once constituted a permanent solution. Organizations were not machines that could be corrected and then left to run without monitoring. They were collections of people making daily decisions under pressure, and they required ongoing attention at every level to stay aligned with the values they claimed to hold. He would be back. Not dramatically, not with advance notice, not in a company car with a scheduled arrival window. He would come back the same way he had come the first time in the truck, through the front entrance, carrying nothing that required explanation. The Gulfstream had taken off from the private tarmac at 4 in the afternoon, Olivia aboard, with 2 board members, and the Atlanta-based HR firm's lead consultant headed back to their respective cities, with the documentation and the next set of tasks. Lucas had watched it lift from the far end of the service road, the gear retracting cleanly into the fuselage, the aircraft banking south and then diminishing against the late sky until it was a white point moving away from everything it had just been part of. He had stood there for a moment with his briefcase and then walked back to the truck. He merged onto the interstate now with the windows cracked and the radio off, and the fields on either side of the highway moved in the peripheral way that landscapes move when you are paying attention to something else. He was not thinking about Megan Carter or the lobby or the walk from the entrance plaza to the elevator bank. He was thinking about the freight brokerage in the strip mall outside Nashville and his father's handwriting on a yellow legal pad, and the particular quality of a problem that only shows itself when you stop performing and start looking. The truck held the road without drama the way it always did. He drove.